From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Today we are producing more than 3 million pages, including more than 2,000 videos and 180,000 images.
On Friday, a press conference at the US Department of Justice, watched by newsrooms around the world, announced the release of an absolutely enormous tranche of new documents. This was the latest, and as far as we know, the final drop of the Epstein files.
The latest dump from the Epstein files after weeks of political pressure. Not all of the information in there will be verified or necessarily true.
Journalists have been poring over the files ever since they were released, and it didn't take long to find some startling new documents.
Pictures appearing to show Andrew Mountbatten Windsor crouched over an unidentified woman are featured in the latest disclosure of files linked to the late American sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
The files, which will have dealt a fresh blow to Buckingham Palace, have reignited public outrage over the extent of the relations between the former Duke and the convicted child sex offender.
There is further fallout from the Epstein files. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says the disgraced former Prince Andrew Mountbatten Windsor should testify before the US Congress about his links to the deceased child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
So what have we now learned about the strength of the links between the former prince and Jeffrey Epstein? And the files read like a roll call of the rich and powerful. So will there ever be a public reckoning? The story today, the new Epstein files.
I'm Kate Mansey. I'm the assistant editor and royal editor at The Times.
Kate, it's been quite the weekend. Just tell us about the moment when those files dropped.
So 4 p.m. UK time on Friday, we had this huge drop from US Congress on the Department of Justice website there. What that was 3 kind of data dumps, if you like, but I'm talking huge. So over 3 million pages that we had put out on the website. And then you had every journalist in the world looking through those documents. And I'm talking about emails, correspondence, flight logs, pictures, videos. And then we obviously had a team to systematically sift through those as quickly as we could. Now, these were the latest and final bunch released by US Congress to fulfill their duty that they were tasked to release all the documents about the Epstein investigation and those around him, carried out by the FBI and US authorities. And they feel that this final release has fulfilled that mandate.
Just give us a sense of the scale of this drop. I mean, what was it like being in a newsroom when something as big as that breaks?
There is a sense of excitement, of course, in the newsroom. We had different channels set up, sort of Slack channels on our emails, foreign desk, news desk, US office, picture desk, everybody kind of pulling together, trying not to duplicate any effort so that we could get to the bottom of the story and talk about, picking kind of pearls from the bottom of the ocean. It's just, there's so much to sift through.
And when you have more than 1 million documents being dropped, I mean, how do you begin to just sort through that en masse?
There is a search function on the Department of Justice website. It's pretty rudimentary, I would have to say. So we were divvying up different terms. So, we'd search for the Duke, we'd search for Prince, we'd search for Palace, we'd search for Andrew, we'd search for Andy, we'd search for Sarah Ferguson, Sarah, Fergie. We would search for Mandelson. One of the searches that we found yielded so many good stories last time and did so again was this term invisible man, which was an alias we understand Andrew used in his communication with Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein. That did bring up quite a lot of documents.
And how much in these documents has been redacted? I mean, can you see everything?
This time, I think you can see quite a lot. So when I've seen redactions, I don't always know who's emailing who, but you can sometimes tell from what they're saying. So, for example, perhaps Andrew thought that Invisible Man would be a good alias, but elsewhere somebody refers to Andrew in the chain of the emails. It's not a foolproof alias from that perspective. In terms of redactions, there's redactions on, as you would expect and hope there to be, the pictures. There are redactions so that you can't identify those individuals. A case in point would be that picture that we saw over the weekend, which emerged from this huge mountain of information of Andrew on all fours over a woman who's lying fully clothed on the floor. He's looking up at the camera. Now there's a redaction, so you can't make out who she is. If you knew her and knew where she was at the time, perhaps you might be able to, but to anybody looking at that picture, you can't see who she is. You can certainly tell, however, that is Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as he's now known.
That image, I think, stopped everyone in their tracks this weekend. It was a remarkable moment. And we should say we haven't got to the end of these documents. There are still journalists all over the world trawling through them. There will be more revelations to come. But in terms of what we've already learned, Kate, in your role as royal editor, you've been brilliant at laying out over the past year the consequences for the now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor of some of the earlier revelations on Jeffrey Epstein. How much more have we learned now about how close that relationship was?
It's hard to know where to start, to be honest. You've got information about a 26-year-old Russian woman who is being offered up to Andrew for a dinner date by Epstein directly. I mean, this is a story that's been going on for a long time. And you'll remember last year, somebody very close to the king told me that there was a tipping point came for Andrew when it emerged in one of the previous document releases that he had misled people about the time scale of his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. That was a tipping point for Charles, I was told. And that swiftly led to the fact that, within weeks, he had his prince title, he had his Duke of York title taken away, he had his royal status revoked, essentially. And that was as a result of Andrew misleading people, saying that he had cut off ties with Epstein at the end of 2010. But in fact, it's emerged that since then, he's been in touch with him. People might be looking at this story now and thinking, well, hang on, didn't we already know all of this? But actually, it's incredibly interesting and important this time round because it shows the depths of the relationship that not just Andrew, but Sarah Ferguson, his former wife, also had with Epstein and with Ghislaine Maxwell. We're seeing very personal correspondence between them all. We have an email here in this latest document dump in which Ghislaine Maxwell describes Andrew as her best friend. She talks about her love for him. We see an email from Ghislaine Maxwell, currently serving 20 years prison sentence for her part in helping Epstein abuse women. We see an email from Maxwell to Andrew the day after the Queen Mother died in 2002, offering her condolences and saying how happy she was to have been able to have met the Queen Mother. There's a new email that's come out in which Andrew invites Epstein to Buckingham Palace for dinner. Now, this was after Epstein had been released from house arrest for pleading guilty to sex offences of soliciting prostitution.
And in the discrepancies of that timeline of their friendship, that was always the moment he said, he sort of cut off contact. He only met him to end his friendship.
I went to see him, and I was doing a number of other things in New York at the time, and we had an opportunity to go for a walk in the park, and that was the conversation, coincidentally, that was photographed, which was when I said to him, look, because of what has happened, I don't think it is appropriate that we should remain in contact. And by mutual agreement during that walk in the park, we decided that we would part company, and I left, I think it was the next day. And to this day, I never had any contact with him from that day forward.
Now we have him inviting him to Buckingham Palace.
Not just that, but we also have Andrew's chief aide, his former private secretary, or who was at the time, emailing Epstein's assistant to say, have you got room for Andrew's 2 bodyguards? Can they come over to stay with Epstein in New York? Can you find some room for them? And these were serving members of the Metropolitan Police who were paid to protect Andrew. This was at a time when Andrew was UK trade envoy, a working British royal family member.
For the King, this will be uncomfortable because, as you've mentioned, it does bring the scandal right to the doors of Buckingham Palace, not only with Jeffrey Epstein being invited for dinner after he's been convicted. At the same time, we've heard allegations about a victim being trafficked to Buckingham Palace. What do we know about that?
What is interesting about this latest document release is not just the documents therein, but what it has now triggered. A woman now in the States has spoken to Brad Edwards, a lawyer, and this is the second woman who seems to have come forward saying that she was trafficked to the UK for sex with Andrew. That's interesting because the only allegations previously were Virginia Giuffre. Andrew's always said that he's never done anything wrong. He's never admitted any liability, any wrongdoing, and he settled that civil claim with no admission of liability out of court. But if somebody else brings a case, it raises it all back again. I mean, you say that it'll be difficult for King Charles. I mean, it's hugely embarrassing at best, damaging at worst. I was with Prince William a couple of weeks ago in Scotland, and as he and Kate got out of a car to go into a community event, a heckler shouted, "Well, how long have you known about Andrew and Epstein? Have you been covering up for Andrew?"
How long have you known about Andrew and Epstein? How long have you known about Andrew and Epstein? Have you been covering up for Andrew?
Now, that, bringing the scandal right into their faces while they're on official engagements, doing their duty for the institution, will be a real touch point for the royal family. This will be something they'll be absolutely keen to kind of stamp out. It had been hoped that last year, with the King's very steely resolve to rid him of his Prince title, rid him of his Duke of York title, that the matter had maybe been put to bed. I think this just blows that all out of the water again.
From this new tranche of documents, what have we learnt about how close that relationship between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Jeffrey Epstein was, and why he might have been useful to Jeffrey Epstein?
This is a really good question, isn't it? Because why was Andrew taken in by Epstein? Why was he helped so much? I think there's two things here. I think that Andrew offered him a sense of power, a sense of credibility. If he can come out of prison for sex offences, having pleaded guilty, and then go around to the great and good and say, "Oh, I was in Buckingham Palace having dinner with the Duke of York last week," that is a huge cachet. It adds to Epstein's credibility. It was a sense of royal washing his reputation, to be seen in the right places. He was seen at Ascot. He was there at St James's Palace for Andrew's 50th birthday. And I think from Epstein's point of view, it added to his credibility. But on a second point, I think it opened doors for Epstein financially.
Has Andrew Mountbatten Windsor said anything about these new revelations? Is he likely to comment?
Yeah, it's important to note that Andrew has always denied any wrongdoing. But we haven't heard anything since the latest dossier dump. The last time we heard from him was a statement which was put out in October via Buckingham Palace, in which he said that he was relinquishing some of his roles. It's hard to think that he'll see that there's anything to be gained from coming out and speaking. The last time he decided to settle scores and give his side of the story was that disastrous BBC Newsnight interview in 2019, which obviously sparked that decision to cut him off. The Queen, the late Queen, who was very fond of Andrew, her son, perhaps too fond of him, had a bit of a blind spot, some people in the palace say to me, about when it came to Andrew. Even then, the Queen realised it was time for him to step back from his royal role. It was something that he fought at the time because, even his statement over 6 years ago, he said that he was stepping back, in a kind of temporary measure. It was soon made quite clear to Andrew that there would be nothing temporary about this. He would never serve as an official member of the royal family again.
You've been telling us about how these new documents appear to show just the depth of the relationship between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Jeffrey Epstein, and the sort of quid pro quo, what both sides appeared to be getting out of it. You also mentioned Sarah Ferguson, his former wife. She pops up in these documents too. We know that she has in the past publicly distanced herself from Jeffrey Epstein, and in the past we've also seen emails where she apologised to him for having done so. Tell us about the emails we can see in the new documents that have landed. How surprising are they?
They are startling. Lots of emails from Sarah Ferguson. She talks about waiting for Princess Eugenie, her younger daughter, to get back from what she describes as a shagging weekend. She talks about meeting up with Epstein after his release from prison. She's sycophantic in tone. She says thank you to Epstein. She describes him as a legend. She says that he's the brother she wished she had had. She talks about a time when Epstein paid a compliment to her in front of her daughters, how that was the kindest thing he could ever have done. He obviously was somebody who I think she was enthralled to, perhaps a little bit scared of, seemingly very fond of. There's also the sort of a dark side. So we see an email in which she's speaking to her spokesman at the time. I think in the aftermath of an interview she did, in which she distanced herself from Epstein and said that she abhorred paedophilia in all its terms. Obviously, there was a kickback from Epstein about the P word, as Sarah then later calls it. And we see an email from her to her spokesman in which she seems to be panicking a little bit and urging the spokesman to get in touch with the editor of the Evening Standard to not go down the P route, so not go down the paedophile route, we understand. And she seems a little bit panicked by that. It shows such an error of judgment on Sarah Ferguson's part.
There's also sort of hints again of a financial relationship. At some points we have Sarah Ferguson asking Jeffrey Epstein for money.
That's right. At one point she says she's paid back some money that he had given her. They had stayed at his largesse as well, so there was other kind of benefits in kind to being friends with him. And I think that is a kind of royal family for sale. She obviously separated from Andrew in 92 and divorced him in 96. But as we all know, they continued to live together and she retained their title of Duchess of York. And whenever she appeared at charity events, everybody saw her as a duchess, as still, the mother of two royal princesses, and was connected to the royal institution and the monarchy in that way. So for her to be going cap in hand for money is quite something.
And it's particularly uncomfortable. I mean, there are some of the lines where she says things like, "I am at your service, just marry me," will have sent shudders down the spines of anyone in Buckingham Palace right now. In the wake of what we've learnt from these new papers, what does it mean for Andrew and Sarah? As you say, we've already seen them punished for their relationship with Epstein. Is there more that could be done now? How will the palace want to respond?
Yeah, I was speaking to somebody at the palace yesterday who was saying, Andrew very much now is a private individual. All the censures that could be taken against him have been taken against him. What can the king do next? But I know it's something that the palace are looking at very closely and monitoring very closely. Andrew will move out of Royal Lodge. He will move into a place yet to be determined within the Sandringham estate, the King's estate in Norfolk, in much reduced circumstances. All his titles have been taken away. He will never appear on the Buckingham Palace balcony ever again, for example. We will never see him playing any official part with the royal family. I mean, that moment has gone for him. Sarah Ferguson, of course, technically left the family when she divorced Andrew from any official side. But Charles was very fond of Fergie and wanted to keep her close. Last May I was at the palace at an event where Charles had invited Sarah Ferguson, for example. But now she will no longer be styled Duchess of York. She won't be at any public events. They're very much outsiders now. They're very much outcast.
And you mentioned earlier that now a second American woman has come forward with allegations about being trafficked for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Will that lead to legal proceedings now?
It has been suggested that she will pursue a civil suit against Andrew. Quite how he will find the means to fund a defence to that, I don't know. It could well mean that we finally see Andrew in a court in the US if he's compelled to testify, if he can't find the funds to settle out of court. Keir Starmer's called on Andrew to testify before US Congress, and he said, in terms of testifying, I've always said anybody who's got information should be prepared to share that information in whatever form they're asked to do that. You can't be victim-centred if you're not prepared to do that. But, is that likely? From what we've seen from Andrew, it doesn't seem to be. He's never professed to be victim-centred. He's never truly shown any sympathy for Epstein's victims or any willingness to help the authorities with what he knows.
Can he be forced to give evidence?
I think it's very difficult to force Andrew to give evidence. Certainly the King will think that he can't compel his brother to give evidence because he's a private individual. It will maybe matter for the police. I know the Metropolitan Police have looked at opening investigations here, but have never found sufficient evidence. They've said to fully kind of launch a full investigation. Every time they've looked into it, it's been closed down again.
And beyond the former Duke and Duchess of York, what are the other big names that you've spotted?
We had an email which seemed to have been sent by Epstein to himself about Bill Gates, suggesting that he'd been helping Bill to get drugs in order to deal with the consequences of sex with Russian girls, which in a memo to himself on July 18th, 2013, seemed to insinuate that, he'd been helping Bill Gates with an STD or a sexually transmitted disease. Bill Gates told us quite shortly after, these documents dropped on Friday that the claims were absurd, and has strenuously denied them. And then we have allegations against Peter Mandelson, of course, the former US ambassador, and payments that were made seemingly into his account. The stories are just astonishing.
We know that as a result of this new evidence, Peter Mandelson has already resigned his membership of the Labour Party. And just this morning, Sir Keir Starmer has called on the House of Lords to strip Mandelson of his peerage. But just tell us more about the most damning allegations against him in these papers.
The documents suggest he was paid $75,000 in 3 separate transactions in 2003 and 2004. Mandelson says he has no record of the payments to himself and he believes they might be false, but he says he stepped down because he wants to, shield the Labour Party from any further embarrassment. Meanwhile, we've got a picture of him on the front pages of the newspapers today in which he's seen just in his underpants and a T-shirt with a woman whose face has been redacted, so we can't see her identity.
It is fascinating to see what people are willing to say and do when they don't think anyone will ever find out about it.
Yeah. Was Epstein gathering any kind of compromat? That's always been the kind of suggestion, hasn't it? He had a great deal of information, damaging information on very influential people, which presumably, if he needed to, he could call on a few favours. He was the puppet master. He had them dancing to his tune.
Are there any sort of legal investigations that are still ongoing around all of this?
In the US, obviously Congress is still open to people testifying, to information carrying on. In the UK, less so. I mean, we've had Kemi Badenoch, leader of the opposition, today calling for an inquiry into who knew what and when. It wouldn't surprise me if inquiries of some kind were opened. I think there's so many more questions that need to be answered. There's so many more questions that are raised by these documents, not least of which what Andrew was doing when he was UK trade envoy, an ambassador for the UK. He was an ambassador for 10 years as a special representative, flying all around the world, representing Britain PLC. And yet behind the scenes, he was in a very close friendship with not just Epstein, but Ghislaine Maxwell. We have, as a paper, as the Times, we have submitted countless freedom of information requests about Andrew's time in that role. Often we've been blocked. I think now's the time that we really do need some answers to what was going on there. The taxpayers were funding it. At the time, he was an official member of the royal family. He was operating as a British ambassador. What really was he doing behind the scenes?
Kate, having seen these documents, having seen the way these very famous and rich people in the public eye interact with Jeffrey Epstein and sort of with each other, you know, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, when he did that famous interview with Emily Maitlis, said he wasn't sorry he knew Jeffrey Epstein because of all the introductions it had provided him with.
Do I regret the fact that he has quite obviously conducted himself in a manner unbecoming? Yes.
Unbecoming? He was a sex offender.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being polite, in the sense that he was a sex offender. But no. Was I right in having him as a friend at the time? And bearing in mind this was some years before he was accused of being a sex offender. I don't think there was anything wrong then.
What does all of this tell us about how power and money work in the modern world?
It raises some really damaging and worrying questions about the nature of power and money in society. I think we are living in a new time where perhaps there's less of a chance for people to hide away behind the scenes anymore. Certainly these emails that we've seen between Epstein and Andrew, they weren't thinking that they would ever be released. They felt that they were being cute and clever, you know, Andrew calling himself the Invisible Man. I think he thought he was being quite smart, and this has shown that everything's caught up with him.
And just a reminder, being referred to in an email or any other document does not imply any wrongdoing. That was Kate Mansey, assistant editor and royal editor for The Times. If you have any thoughts or questions about the Epstein files, do get in touch. This is a story that we will be returning to. Our email is thestory@thetimes.com. The producers today were Julia Webster and Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Tim Walklate, and sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.